Kiyoshi Kuromiya was born Stephen Kuromiya, and is a pretty amazing civil rights activist and was active in various movements throughout his life. And I think the thing that put him on that path was that in 1943, he was born in a Japanese American internment camp in Wyoming called Heart Mountain. Through numerous interviews, he talks about that, and he talks about that being I think, a critical factor in his becoming a civil rights activist, because that was in an unjust thing that was done to Japanese Americans in the 1940s during World War II, and ended up, I think, getting some money from the United States government for reparations for being born in the internment camp. Again, he was born in a Japanese American internment camp in 1943. His family was originally from Monrovia, California, and in around 1961, he applied to and was accepted at the University of Pennsylvania to study architecture, presumably under Louis Kahn, who was a noted architect at the time. He was interested in studying under Louis Kahn. He spent more time, I think, as a civil rights activist than he did as a student. We actually have his transcripts from that time, and they weren't impressive. But really from the beginning of his moving to Philadelphia, he was participating in African-American demonstrations against segregated lunch counters in Maryland. He participated in demonstrations in Alabama during that time. He was beaten pretty severely at a demonstration. I want to say it was in 1963 in Selma. We do have a picture of him with Dr. Martin Luther King, where he's talking about, the treatment of demonstrators by the police at some of those demonstrations. We have, he said that he was at the March on Washington in 1964, if I'm not mistaken, 63 or 64. I'm blanking on when that demonstration was. I want to say it was 1963. And there's even rumors that he babysat King's children during that demonstration, but we have no confirmation of any of that happening. So he was definitely at the forefront of fighting for African-American civil rights. And throughout his entire career, he's able to make connections between what happened to him in the internment camps and how that connects all oppressed communities. African Americans, gays, and lesbians throughout his entire life. So he also protested the Vietnam War, again, seeing all the connections between oppressed communities, including the North Vietnamese. And in, I want to say, 1967 or 1968, he staged a very famous demonstration where he put up posters around the University of Pennsylvania campus saying, tomorrow on the University of Green, we are going to napalm a dog. And so thousands of people showed up the next day in outrage. And as he said, of course, we're not going to do this. If you had as much sympathy for the North Vietnamese people as you had for potentially for a dog, then we'd be able to shut down this war. So towards the latter part of the 1960s, he was involved with various anti-war demonstrations. There's one where he was, along with Abby Hoffman, they were trying to levitate the Pentagon in Washington. So, he was kind of swept up in the sort of 60s furor. But he was also very aware of some of the oppression that homosexuals were experiencing in the 1960s. And here I think were called Remembrance Days, which were protests in the very first anti-gay, some of the very first pro-gay demonstrations that were happening in the United States happened for between 1965 and 1968 in front of Independence Hall in Philadelphia, and he participated in those. So again, always at the forefront of seeing oppressed communities and trying to, advocate for them, and seeing the connections between all of those oppressed communities. So he did this. He started the Gay Liberation Front in Philadelphia. And at one point in time, he ended up meeting Buckminster Fuller, who was, for those of you who don't know, he was an architect. He was a futurist. I think one of his famous pieces of work was the dome at the 1968 Expo in Montreal, Canada. And he wrote a number of books about the future, and Kiyoshi and him became very, very good friends. Buckminster Fuller was teaching at the University of Pennsylvania, so somehow they met. And Kiyoshi helped Fuller write his last 4 volumes of work. And one of those was a book called The Critical Path. And Kiyoshi is actually listed as adjuvant. And the word adjuvant means something that enables a chemical reaction. And that was kind of Kiyoshi. If you ever listen to Buckminster Fuller and some of the speeches he gave, it was sort of, he was all over the place. He was very smart, but he was kind of difficult to pin down. And that was Kiyoshi's job, was to kind of pin him down. So the idea behind the critical path was, if you have a complex problem, you break it down into its simplest forms, and then you try to tackle those simplest forms. So when the AIDS crisis happened, Kiyoshi devoted most of his time to trying to tackle some of the problems some of the problems of the AIDS crisis, and that was getting accurate information, because I don't know if any of you know about this, but during the early years of the AIDS crisis, there was not a lot of good information out there. And Kiyoshi had an intimate understanding of the power of the internet. Like back in the 1980s, this was just the beginning of the World Wide Web and of email. And Kiyoshi kind of knew that this was going to be a really powerful force for distributing information. So first, he started off with the Critical Path newsletter. And at first, it was just a mimeograph newsletter that he sent around to different communities, including people who were incarcerated. Because again, going back to his time when he was born in the internment camp in 1943, he also understood that people who were incarcerated were also oppressed communities. So he would send his mimeograph newsletter to various constituencies around the United States. Later, he began to understand that the World Wide Web was going to be powerful, so he created websites for the Critical Path newsletter. And again, this is well before, many people really even had email addresses. And I have a lot of friends in Philadelphia who their first email proxy, if you want to call it that, was critpath.org. A lot of people who I know got their free internet access, their free email access through Critical Path, which was Kiyoshi. So ACT UP got started in the late 1980s. He was very involved with ACT UP. He participated in lots of demonstrations. He was attending worldwide AIDS conferences and was able to synthesize very complex scientific information And he, did this because he wanted the immediate response of scientists to what was going on in terms of AIDS information and AIDS cures or medicines, because he wanted to be able to send that out to his constituency. So he would go to these international conferences, sit up in the front, take notes, and he'd be the first one afterwards that would go up and say to scientists, so is this exactly what you were saying? So he would, go up and he would have this innate understanding of complex scientific jargon about some of the research that was happening for HIV and AIDS, and then he would report it out in his newsletter. So, and at the same time, he was also on the front lines protesting the lack of funding his aid into 19 things toward that he participated. One was that he was part of a class action lawsuit. Am I still there? I'm getting the unstable signal again. So there were two things that he did towards the end of his life that was very interesting. One, he was part of a class action lawsuit against the Communications Decency Act, which was passed somewhere in the mid-90s during the Clinton administration. And one of the provisions was that you couldn't distribute what they called obscene material to minors. And what Kiyoshi tried to tell, what he tried to say was that AIDS information can sometimes be sexually explicit. And if you, bar any kind of sexually explicit information from reaching teens, that could lead to the spread of AIDS. So it led to the overturning of that particular provision of the Communications Decency Act in the mid-1990s. He participated in one other class action lawsuit against medical marijuana. He asserted, and he was quite right in this, that marijuana was really the only viable drug for people who had HIV and AIDS, and it was prohibited by federal law, and he tried to overturn that through this class action lawsuit, and he lost that one. And that was around 1999, right before he passed. And one of the interesting things that happened, he died of, I forget how it was listed on his death certificate, but he had lung cancer earlier in his life, and it had come back, and it might have been due, he had also been diagnosed with HIV and AIDS. It might have been due to that as a, kind of a counter, as a exacerbated by the fact that he had HIV and AIDS. And he, there was nothing that died for really him. Formed a 24/7 pod where there was always somebody with him at the end of his life. And he passed in like one day, either before or after his 57th birthday in the year 2000. And one of the things that we did last year on his 80th birthday is we got the City Council of Philadelphia to designate it as Kiyoshi Kuromiya Day. So I'm going to say it was May 9th. Every May 9th, it will be Kiyoshi Kuromiya Day in the city of Philadelphia. So that was me talking for a long time, hitting what I think the highlights of his life were. And I think if anybody has questions, I can kind of open the floor to questions about Kiyoshi.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. I have a question. I don't know if everybody knows about the documentary you're producing. Where are you with it, and what's going on, and when's it coming out?
So 2 years ago, somewhere around then, I produced an audio documentary because I have lots of friends who knew Kiyoshi. And at one point in time, I was like looking for a subject for an audio documentary. And like I'd actually met Kiyoshi back in the 1980s or 90s. So I knew of him, but I didn't really know the depth of the work that he had done throughout his life. And so the more I researched it, the more I said, oh my God, this guy is amazing. So I did an audio documentary. And if anybody is interested, it's on the KiyoshiProject.com, which is a website I created to house the audio documentary. But it was, you know, in an hour is not a lot of time to go through somebody's full life. So I recruited a very well-known director in Philadelphia, and we applied for some funding from the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage. And so we got some money from them and a few other sources to begin production on a documentary, a film documentary about his life. And so we're in pre-production right now, but starting this summer, we will start conducting interviews and start doing that part of the work. And one of the parts that we're going to do is we're going to go to Heart Mountain in Wyoming in July. They're having what they're calling a pilgrimage, where people, probably mostly second generation, whom, if I'm not mistaken, are called sensei. I don't know if I have that term right. Second generation Japanese American.
It's a
Ja
third, yeah, it's Sansei.
Sansei, yeah.
That's the
So
third generation.
third generation, most of the first generation are now passed. So, you know, people that were connected with their relatives who were at one of the incarceration camps, that's, you know, that will be happening mid to end of July. And we're going to go there, try to get some interviews, try to get some footage of Heart Mountain, because again, everything in Kiyoshi's life stemmed from his being born in that internment camp back in 1943. So this summer is kind of when we'll be really doing like the major work in filming for this documentary. And we're thinking that, you know, mid to late 25 is when we'll distribute it. We'll probably, one of the outlets will be Asian American film festivals. I think there's a big one in San Francisco and one in Los Angeles. So we'll, you know, apply to film festivals for screening the documentary.